This is the first video in a study of Ezra and Nehemiah. There will be 6 videos in this brief series. They will not be extremely long videos, but they will provide an introductory study for these 2 books, and there will be additional applications to be made throughout our study. As we come to the book of Ezra, in this first video in the series, I want to speak today about the necessity of establishing foundations of hope. As we look at the book of Ezra and we begin to think about the return from exile, in order to understand the book, it's essential that we understand that Ezra tells us about 2 of 3 returns from the exile. In Ezra 1:1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout the realm and put it in writing. And the proclamation is in the document that begins in verse 2, but it is authority and permission for Israel, for the Jews to return to their homeland, to return from exile. And so after 70 years of exile, after 70 years of living away from their homeland, after 70 years of despair, they will be able to return. And for that, we look at the question, is there any hope? And Ezra will answer, yes, there is hope. The present is never the future. The present is not influenced by the past. We can always look ahead. To understand more completely the way that the book of Ezra is constructed and the importance of the book, I want to briefly note that the timeline that we're dealing with is that beginning in 609 BC, or perhaps 608, we could use the date, the carrying away, the exile into Babylon began with the Battle of Carchemish, Josiah going out to encounter King Necho, good King Josiah, who had found the book of the law in the temple during a period of reconstruction. With the death of King Josiah, Babylon became supreme and began to overrun the southern area of Israel that we know as Judah, thinking about the division of the tribes. And so in 609, for another 23 years, Babylon had some level of control, and ultimately in 586 we have the destruction of the temple. To try to understand the 70 years of exile, there are 2 possibilities. I've noted on the slide that Ezra 1:1 is telling us about a return that began in 538 BC. We cannot worry about 1 year either way in these dates because the years did not correspond perfectly to our years. So it may be 538, 539, same case in 609. But what I wanted to note with you is that 609, with the death of Josiah and the beginning of the carrying away, here we have the beginning of the return, and there's a period of exactly 70 years. Between 608, 609, and 538, 539. So after the 70 years of exile and despair, Ezra is going to tell us about a return. Now, this is not a return that Ezra was involved in. This is a return, the list of the exiles who returned with Sheshbazzar. We have the first return that we read about in Exodus 1. We can see details of that return in 1:11. In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver, and Sheshbazzar brought all of these along when the exiles came from Babylon to Jerusalem. We will not read about the return that Ezra was involved in. This is the second return that we read about in the book of Ezra. We will not read about that return until we begin to read in 7 verse 1. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, Zadok, Ahitub, Amariah, Azariah, the son of Meratoth, the son of Zerahiah, the long list that we have there. This Ezra, very clear who he is. This Ezra came up from Babylon, and the return that we will read about with Ezra is a return that occurred in 458. And so we will look at that return in one of the other lessons of the book. So we're not talking about Ezra the person, we're talking about Ezra the book. As we think about the Ezra, the importance of laying foundations of hope, this is not Ezra the person. That does not begin till 7:1. This is Ezra the book that is communicating to us with the return of Sheshbazzar in 538 BC, the importance of looking forward with hope. So this return is in 538, and as we read through the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra, we will find that with the instruction of Haggai and Zechariah, that the temple was completed and dedicated, and that year will be 516, which gives us another 70-year period. We have the destruction of the temple in 586. We have the completion of the temple and the dedication of the temple in 516. So there is another 70-year period. All of this reconstruction occurred with Haggai and Zechariah, chapter 5 and verse 1. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, descendant of Iddo, prophesied in the name of God, the God of Israel, who was over them. And it was because of those prophecies that the temple reconstruction was completed in 516. So within 22 years, and there was a delay, and we'll talk about that delay, but there was a delay after Sheshbazzar returned in 538 because of external opposition. There was a delay in the reconstruction of the temple, but it was completed in 516, which would be exactly 70 years after the destruction in 586. So I hope that we have the basic backgrounds. I'll try to review this for you again in other videos. But in Ezra chapter 1 through 6, in Ezra chapter 1 through 6, the question that we're raising today concerning the message of the book, is there any hope? And the answer is yes. The present is not the future. And for that reason, we can identify 7 principles. These are videos that are designed to provide foundations for studies in Bible classes. These videos are no more than 10 to 12 minutes. They can be viewed by the class, and then each of the texts that we have cited here can be studied in more detail. The principle can be established, the message can be heard, and the meaning and the application for us today can also be heard. Principle number 1, 7 principles that we will briefly review and cite here for your study. Number 1, God is at work in the circumstances of life. Notice in chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make the proclamation." Whether we're dealing with good circumstances or bad circumstances, God is at work in the circumstances of our lives. A second principle that I would like to encourage you to see in the book and to study to understand applications is that God is at work among his people, not only in the circumstances of life, not only in the case of Cyrus, but God is at work among his people as we begin reading in chapter 1 and verse 8. As he has prepared hearts, the conclusion is that Cyrus had them brought all of these various treasures, and they were counted out to Sheshbazzar, and they're ready to go. The inventory is given. But look back with me to verse 5 when it says, "The family heads of Judah and Benjamin, the priests, the Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem." They were going for the specific purpose of rebuilding the house of the Lord, even though it took them 22 years. And it says that God prepares hearts. God is not only at work in the circumstances of life, God is also at work among his people, preparing hearts. A third principle we will find in chapter 3 and verse 8. The Bible says, in the second month of the second year after their arrival, they've now been back just barely over a year, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Took them a little while to get going, but notice what it says, that they all joined together and that they were willing to do the work of the Lord. The builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord. The priests were there. The Levites were there. The people gave a great shout. Many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept, but the people celebrated. Chapter 3 and verse 11, a fourth principle. These two principles in a single text from chapter 3, at the end of the text 8 through 11, the people were willing to do God's work, and the people celebrated God. Now in chapter 4 and verse 1, I've already mentioned the obstacles that caused the delay. A fifth principle is that there will always be opposition. There will always be those who are opposed to doing God's work. These opponents are external, but the people met obstacles. There was opposition to the rebuilding by the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. When they heard the exiles were building, chapter 4 and verse 1, that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, they came to Zerubbabel and began to try to discourage them. When they could not discourage them, they eventually sent a letter to the Xerxes that would cause the building to stop. So they tried to get the Persians to interfere and to cause the building to stop. The letter was responded to positively. Other letters were sent. We have a long period of time, the 20 years of delay, opposition under Xerxes, opposition under Artaxerxes, a time with Darius, the king also. The people were meeting those obstacles, but in chapter 6 and verse 14 is a sixth principle, and that is the people rebuilt the temple as a result of good preaching. The elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo, and they finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus. So, a sixth matter that you may wish to discuss: the people rebuilt the temple as a result of hearing the word of the Lord. To do God's will requires that we know that will, and always there's a need for good Bible study, and I encourage you to study this principle also as you share together in analyzing and applying this text. The final principle I want to mention is in 6:16. The people of Israel, priests, Levites, rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. Regardless of how much disappointment may come into our lives, we can see causes of joy. So the question we had as we looked at Ezra chapters 1 through 6, is there any hope? And these 7 principles give us reasons for hope. God is at work. God is at work among his people, not only in circumstances. When people are willing to do his work, we celebrate God. Even in the midst of obstacles, the people rebuilt the temple with good preaching. And in the midst of disappointment, especially from those who had seen the glory of the former temple, there was hope and there was joy. 70 years have passed, 70 years of despair, not knowing how God will act, but now God's presence is among them. They can clearly see that God has been at work. May that be also our experience as we study together Ezra chapters 1 through 6. God bless you.